The road to Dachau. The day we arrived at Dachau, it felt like the entire world had been holding its breath for years. No one spoke as we marched through the barren fields, the silence hanging heavy like a thick fog. The wind cut through us like a blade, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the feeling that something was about to change, something big. I had seen death before, sure. War has a way of introducing you to it, up close and personal. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited us in that place. Nothing. And in those first moments, as we approached the gates, I remember thinking how surreal it all felt. You don't expect history to jump out at you in real time, to be standing in a moment so monstrous that you can feel the weight of it pressing on your chest. But there we were, soldiers, coming face to face with the very worst of humanity. As we moved closer, the stench hit us first. It wasn't the smell of anything I could put a name to. It wasn't like the odor of death you'd expect from a battlefield, or the rot of the human body left to decay. No, this was something darker, something more suffocating. A mixture of burnt flesh, sweat, and something far worse that I couldn't even begin to describe. We didn't know what we'd find. Rumors had been floating around for days. But rumors are rumors. Stories are stories. It's not until you see it for yourself, feel it in your gut, that you understand how the human soul can be stripped to its bare bones. I could hear the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked, but it felt as if the world around me was still. A quiet so absolute that I could hear the beating of my own heart, a dull thump that matched the rhythm of my footsteps. I glanced to my left and saw a few of the men, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. You could almost taste the tension in the air. We had been trained for battle, for survival, for taking life if we had to. But what we were about to witness wasn't about war anymore. It was about something deeper, something darker. The war had ended, but the nightmare was far from over. We passed through the gates, and for a moment I felt like I was walking through a dream. Or a nightmare, I suppose. The barracks loomed before us, broken, decaying, as if time itself had given up on this place. The buildings were empty shells, their windows shattered, and the rusting remnants of barbed wire twisted and curled around the grounds. The air was heavy with the echoes of screams that seemed to linger long after the last voice had fallen silent. But it wasn't the buildings that got to me first. It was the people. Or rather, what was left of them. I had heard stories about the prisoners, about how they were starved, worked to death, broken down by the brutality of it all. But seeing them in the flesh, was something else entirely. You think you understand something when you hear it, but you can't truly know until you look into the eyes of someone who's lived through it. And when I looked into those eyes, I saw nothing. No hope, no fear, no anger. Just an emptiness that swallowed everything around it. They were so thin, their faces gaunt and hollow like skulls dressed in skin. Some of them barely moved as we passed by, their bodies too weak to even lift their heads. Others were different. Their eyes burned with something fierce. I don't know what it was, rage, maybe, or desperation, but it was there, flickering like a dying ember. I could hear the rustle of their feet on the gravel, the soft shuffle of their movements, and it felt like the earth itself was mourning with us. I wanted to turn away, to block it all out, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away from their faces. They were a mirror of the horrors this world had forced upon them. They were the living proof of everything we had been fighting against. And yet, as I stared at them, I couldn't help but wonder, how had we allowed this to happen? I tried not to think about it. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it lingered, clung to me like a shadow. There was one prisoner in particular that I'll never forget. He was standing near the fence, his eyes locked onto mine. He was thin, impossibly thin, but his gaze was strong. It was like he was trying to tell me something beyond words. I didn't know if it was a plea for help, or if it was just the way the human spirit survives, even in the face of certain death. But before I could think too much about it, we were ushered inside. The sounds of our boots against the floor filled the otherwise deafening silence. It felt wrong, like we didn't belong there, like we were intruding on something sacred, something that was not ours to witness. But that was the thing about war, it doesn't ask for permission. Inside, the stench was even worse. It wasn't just the smell of decay anymore. Now, it was the smell of despair, of broken souls trying to hold on to whatever little was left of their humanity. I could see the shadows of people moving in the corners of my vision, but there was no real movement. They were just there. And I wasn't sure if they were real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. It wasn't until we reached the main yard that I saw the full extent of it. The bodies. There were bodies everywhere, scattered like discarded pieces of something once whole. Some were lying still, others half draped over fences, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The worst part was that it was clear that these bodies hadn't just died. They had been treated like objects, like nothing more than refused to be discarded when they were no longer useful. I don't remember the exact moment I realized it, but I do know that the moment I understood, something inside me broke. It wasn't just the bodies. It was the realization that we had witnessed this kind of evil, and yet somehow we had allowed it to happen. How had we stood by and let this go on? How had we let these people suffer for so long? And that's when the questions started. Questions that I still don't have the answers to. What do you do when you see something like this? How do you reconcile it with everything you've been taught, with everything you thought you knew about humanity? Can you even call it humanity anymore? But all those questions, every last one of them, could wait for later. Because right then, in that moment, all I could do was stand there and stare and feel the weight of it all pressing down on me like a mountain. And that was just the beginning. As we walked deeper into the camp, the ground beneath our feet seemed to tremble with the weight of what had happened here. The wind had died down by then, but a different kind of chill had settled in, one that seeped into your bones, your very soul. It wasn't the cold air, it was something else. Something more ancient. It was the kind of chill that comes from staring at something so horrible, so unfathomable, that it feels as if the universe itself is recoiling in disgust. We were led through narrow, dimly lit hallways, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. The walls seemed to close in around us, and I could feel the eyes of the prisoners following us from every direction. Their gazes weren't hostile, not exactly. They were empty, distant, as if they had been looking at the same horror for so long that they had stopped reacting to it. But there were a few who couldn't help themselves. A few who still had enough fight left in them to give us a look that felt like a challenge, or maybe a warning. I couldn't blame them. They had seen things that none of us could even begin to comprehend. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had they been through? What had they endured to reach the point where they no longer felt pain, no longer felt fear? It was like they were trapped in a place that time had forgotten, a place where humanity itself had been stripped away, piece by piece. I glanced over at one of my comrades, Corporal Martin, and saw that his face was pale, his eyes glazed over, like he was staring at something beyond our world. I knew exactly how he felt. I could feel my own mind beginning to unravel, like a thread slowly being pulled apart. What were we supposed to do here? How could we process what we were seeing? The prisoners moved in slow, deliberate motions, their feet shuffling, their bodies swaying, as if each step took every ounce of their strength. There were no sounds of chatter, no laughter, no cries of anguish, just the faint sound of bare feet scraping against the cold concrete floor. We passed by one man who was leaning against a wall, his face half hidden by the tattered rags that hung from his thin frame. He was staring at the ground, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as though holding onto some piece of himself that hadn't been broken yet. The air inside the barracks was thick with a heavy, almost suffocating stillness. There were no words spoken, no cries of help. It was as if the very act of speaking had been taken from them, as if the ability to express anything, anger, fear, hope, had been wiped away long ago. I don't know how long we stood there, just watching them, watching as they moved through their daily existence, a routine that no longer had any meaning, any purpose. It was then that I saw it, the first glimpse of what had truly broken these people. It wasn't just the hunger, or the exhaustion. It wasn't just the abuse they had endured, the beatings, and the forced labor. No, it was something far worse. It was the way they had been robbed of their humanity, the way they had been reduced to nothing more than shells of people, wandering through a world that no longer made sense. They didn't speak because they had forgotten how. They didn't move with purpose because they had forgotten what purpose felt like. They were ghosts, wandering through a place that had swallowed them whole. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a concentration camp. It wasn't just a prison for the body. This was a place where the soul went to die. It was a factory for erasing identity, for stripping away everything that made someone human. And it had worked. I don't know how long we stayed there, but it felt like hours, like days. We were just standing in that place, witnessing the aftermath of something so monstrous that words couldn't capture it. How do you describe something like that? How do you put it into words? I could feel my mind trying to process it, but there was no framework, no language to make sense of what I was seeing. It was beyond words, beyond anything I had ever imagined. Eventually, they led us to a small room at the far end of the barracks. It was empty, except for a single table and a few chairs. The walls were bare, the air stagnant and thick with the scent of sweat and decay. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, like the walls were closing in on me. What was the point of all this? Why had we been brought here? What were we supposed to do with what we were seeing? Was this some kind of sick joke, some twisted test to see how much we could endure? It was hard to tell anymore. And then, as if on cue, a man stepped into the room. He was tall, gaunt, his face pale from lack of sunlight, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, something alive. He wasn't like the others. He moved with purpose, his steps confident, as if he had not been broken by the horrors of this place. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the room, taking in each of us one by one. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried in the silence like a bell tolling in the distance. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his gaze piercing through us. "You've seen the truth." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. But then he continued. "You think you know what's going on here. You think you understand. But you don't. Not yet." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. As if he knew something we didn't. Something we weren't supposed to know. "You're about to see it all," he said. "Everything." And that was the moment. That was the moment when I knew that whatever we thought we understood about this place, we were wrong. That whatever horrors we had witnessed, they were only the beginning. It wasn't just about the death. It wasn't just about the suffering. It was something more. Something darker. And we were about to find out exactly what that was. The man who had spoken to us stood there, his eyes fixed on us like a predator sizing up its prey. The room felt colder now, as if the very air was alive with anticipation. His presence seemed to demand something from us, something we weren't ready to give. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as if we were afraid that any sound would shatter the fragile tension that held us in place. He didn't wait for us to respond, nor did he seem to expect one. Instead, he stepped closer to the table, his movements measured, deliberate. His hands were shaking, just slightly, but there was a fierceness in the way he clenched his fists that made me uneasy. He was a man who had seen too much, who had lived through more horrors than most people could even imagine. And yet, in the way he spoke, there was a calmness, an unsettling calmness, that made me feel like we were standing on the edge of something unspeakable. "You don't understand," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made every word feel like a hammer strike. "Not yet." He moved again, this time walking to the window and staring out into the distance, his silhouette dark against the dim light filtering through the broken panes of glass. For a moment, I thought he might be lost in thought, but then he spoke again, his voice distant, as if he were remembering something long buried. "Most of them are gone now," he said, nodding towards the prisoners we had passed earlier. "The ones who couldn't endure it, the ones who were broken beyond repair." He paused, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "But some of us stayed." The words didn't make sense at first. What did he mean by stayed? The thought began to gnaw at me, but before I could voice the question, he turned back toward us. His eyes were hard now, as if they had seen everything the world could throw at them and still had the strength to endure. "They did things here," he said, his voice low, but filled with an intensity that demanded our attention. "Things that cannot be erased. Things that can't be forgotten, no matter how much you try." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment, we were all trapped in that silence again. But this time, it wasn't just the oppressive quiet of the camp. This silence was different. It was the kind of silence that comes after a terrible truth has been revealed, the kind that makes your blood run cold. Then, as if sensing our confusion, he took a step toward us and lowered his voice even further. "I know what you saw," he said, his eyes narrowing. "The bodies, the suffering. But what you don't know is this wasn't just about killing people. This was about something more. Something deeper. Something darker." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. As the weight of his words settled on me, I felt a cold sweat prick at the back of my neck, and the room seemed to close in on me. I wanted to look away, to push away the reality of what he was saying, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, held in place by the force of his words. There are things in this place, he continued, his voice growing more intense, things you can't explain, things you can't even begin to comprehend. The horrors they committed, they weren't just physical. They were something else, something beyond human understanding. I felt my heart race, the fear creeping up my spine like a slow-burning fire. What was he saying? What kind of horrors could possibly exist beyond the physical? What could possibly be worse than what we had already seen? You think you're here to liberate these people, he said, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't place. Regret, maybe, or something worse. But you're wrong. You're not here to save them. You're here to witness the end of something that should have never been allowed to begin. There was a heaviness in his words, a finality that struck me harder than any blow ever could. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to demand answers, but I couldn't find my voice. The air was too thick, too heavy, and the silence was closing in, suffocating me with the weight of what he was hinting at. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something, then turned his back on us, walking toward the far wall of the room. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world to explain, and yet no time at all to actually say what needed to be said. You'll see soon enough, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It's already started. You can't stop it now. And just like that, he was gone. He left us standing there, in the silence, with nothing but his words hanging in the air. There was no explanation. No answer to the questions that had started to claw at my mind. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. Something that felt wrong, like a puzzle missing its final piece. The room was still. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside, carrying with it the distant echo of something I couldn't quite identify. And in that moment, I knew that what we had witnessed in that camp was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far worse, something we couldn't understand, no matter how hard we tried. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Whatever was coming, whatever we had just stumbled upon, it was too much for any of us to handle. And the questions, the fear, the uncertainty, it would follow us, haunt us for the rest of our lives. Because what we had seen in Dachau wasn't just a chapter in history. It was a warning. A warning that there are things in this world, in the dark corners of human existence, that we are not meant to know. And sometimes, once you open that door, there's no going back.